Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, an In Conversation session. I'm really pleased to welcome Danielle Mulder, who's BBC Group Director of Sustainability. You'll hear a lot more about what she's up to, work at the BBC, and a lot of time for questions. This is an In Conversation session, so that means in conversation with all of you as well. Now, if you had been looking at the program, and the eagle-eyed among you will realize that I'm not, unfortunately, Hannah Stitful from the BBC. You might know her from a lot of her wildlife presenting. Hannah's unfortunately very ill this morning and unable to join, so I have got the pleasure of stepping in from her. Now, my name is Savita Willmott. I'm the director of the Natural History Consortium that puts on Communicate each year. Some of you might know that after 19 years, we're doing something completely different this year. We're doing this online event over 2 days. We've had an event in London yesterday, and I'm actually dialing in from our event at Bristol Zoo, which is fantastic to be able to kind of see all parts of it. So before we hear a bit more from Danielle and a bit more about her work, we are going to try a poll. So I'm going to ask Ellie from the team to pop the poll up for us. So a few different options there. I'm going to ask you to choose one. Give you some time to think about that. And Ellie's keeping an eye out. When we think it's slowing down a bit, we will show you the results. Show you what you think. Okay, so about 38% saying didn't know there was a sustainability function in the BBC. So great that you've come along to join us today. Great start. and a little. So I think, Danielle, that probably gives you a bit of a starting point of where people in the session are coming from.
Yeah.
Is that a surprise? Is that kind of a result and surprise for you?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, sort of large organisations, and the BBC is a large organisation. It operates globally as well. So there's a lot of compliance, if you like, on big organisations now in terms of environmental disclosures and things like that. So, I would expect, big organisations to have somebody like me in place. Or it is growing though and developing. Sometimes it ends up, being sort of part of somebody's role, but I think the whole sustainability discipline, if you like, and how corporates respond to that, corporate sustainability, if you like, is maturing. So yeah, the market's pretty hot, and they are hiring people like me into these kind of roles, and the skills are developing, and I think the associated sort of credentials and academic qualifications is building as well, is what I see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's lots we can get into there, but since we've got, a big group here who don't know so much about sustainability work at the BBC, why don't we start from the beginning? Why don't you tell us about some of the things that the BBC is doing, and it'd be great to know, what's working.
Yeah, no problem at all. So yeah, really happy to be as open and to take questions, by the way, as to what we're doing, how we're doing it, where we're up to. The point of this session is to have, as Savita said, a conversation about it. So I'm going to be as open, as transparent as I can be about the work that we're doing here at the BBC. So we sort of think about sustainability. For my role, it's very focused on the environment. So not to be confused with D&I and governance, other governance elements, that sometimes sustainability can have quite a broad remit, can't it, in terms of picking up the environment, the social aspects, and then the governance piece. It picks up very much squarely the environment piece, and particularly our response to climate change. But I also pick up some of the governance pieces as well that respond to that climate response. So that's the sort of scope of my role as sustainability director at the BBC. And so we've got three pillars that we focus on within that remit. And they are net zero, which I'll expand on because that's the sort of most mature pillar that we've been developing, and I'll explain why. We have something called nature positive, which is evolving, and we're figuring out what our position is on nature and what nature positive means for the BBC. And then we have our third pillar is people positive, and that's very much about the impact of our programming, because obviously we're well known for our wildlife programming, and I'm very happy to talk about that as well, because that's key to our success. So that's kind of how we think about it in terms of how we sort of structure. I think you asked, what's working, where we're up to in that. So in terms of maturity, the net zero piece is the most mature. So I got pulled into the BBC orbit, if you like, just about 8 months before COP26, which was in Glasgow. And I got called in because I have a background and specialism in net zero specifically, and in science-based targets. And they said the BBC needs your help. We need to set a net zero strategy. It needs to be credible, it needs to be ambitious, and it needs to meet the science. The BBC was a major broadcaster at COP26, so it needed a sort of credible position, if you like, and strategy in order to attend and be a broadcaster at COP26. So it was like a hard requirement and deadline. And that's where the work started, really. And then we're building out from there in terms of getting, sight of our strategy against those three pillars. And work is underway. So the net zero piece, we do have a strategy. So Tim laid out that we're going to be net zero by 2030, and that's in line with our peers as well, with Sky, ITV. I think Netflix is slightly more ambitious, but I think it's got a slightly different definition, if you like, of net zero at the moment. And we'll have slightly varying strategies. The BBC one is not heavily reliant on offsetting, for example, and we've actually aligned to SBTI, which is the Science-Based Target Initiative, and set what we call science-based targets. And essentially what those do or mean is that requires us to halve our emissions by 2030, to halve them again by 2040, and then ideally sort of get them down to what we call absolute zero by 2050. And that's, a large part of my job is to turn the BBC into a net zero organisation that makes sure that we don't generate emissions that are contributing to global warming above 1.5 degrees. Right. So that's kind of, what we're up to, and that's working. We have a plan. I've got a business case that's going into our exco at the moment in terms of identifying projects that aren't already in budget, how we're going to finance this, how we're going to deliver it, what the governance structure is around it, what the risks are, what the key milestones are, the technical team that I'm putting in place. And that is definitely working. What's not working, and to be honest with you, most of it is now sort of coming into sight and is working. It's those sort of three pillars. The nature positive piece, it's not as well developed, the biodiversity and nature response. We're obviously, there's brand reputational risk here at the BBC regarding because what we say in our wildlife programming needs to match exactly what we do as an organisation as well. So we have to get that right. It's just not as mature as a conversation around carbon, for example, net zero and the standards and the frameworks that sit behind that, but they're coming. They really are coming. And so we're actually piloting at the moment something called TNFD, which is the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosures, determining as an organisation what is our biodiversity footprint. So I've been working with the University of Oxford to actually sort of measure that, because a lot of what we do needs to have scientific rigour to it. So we do adopt, that approach to measure. And it's the same with our impact work, actually. It's quite nascent. Impact research against media. The reason why it's important is because I have a requirement on me to basically express what we call double materiality means to the BBC. So we can't just sort of say, oh, look over here, this is our operational house, if you like. We also have to take responsibility of our value chain and our products, and our product is media. So, the content that we create. We've signed up to something called the Climate Content Pledge. We did that at COP26 last year. So we've fully committed, along with 11 other broadcasters, to integrate climate science across all of our content. Yeah, news is handled slightly differently. That's the same for the other broadcasters because it needs to be impartial and kept separate, if you like. But that includes all of our explicit content in our natural history unit programming, but also integrating it implicitly across all our sort of non-factual and other factual programs, including dramas, EastEnders, Sewing Bee, etc., and integrating the conversation of climate science into those programs, and also incidentally as well. So it starts to normalize the conversation with our audiences, and people can see, that we're aligned to the science, but also take, what actions people can take to address that. So hopefully that answers the question a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just going back to the nature positive, that seems to be a new term that is coming out that's maybe not as familiar to people in the room as net zero. I hear it used in different contexts. Are you trying to understand what nature positive is for the BBC, or do you have kind of a working definition of nature positive right now?
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, we're working with sort of other partners as well that are very close to the system, called TNFD, which is the sort of nature disclosures, if you like. And I'm also working with Oxford University. As I said, we've completed a biodiversity footprint. We're just refining that at the moment. And our biodiversity footprint, or what TNFD calls our interface as an organisation with nature, is actually quite small compared to carbon and energy. The problem for the media and the problem for the BBC is largely that we use a lot of power, and we need a lot of power to commission, produce and distribute and transmit our programming. All of our programming, and from TV to radio to satellite transmission, etc. It needs a lot of energy, and energy has a carbon implication, a carbon emissions implication with it. So when we've looked at our biodiversity footprint, we do have some risks in our supply chain, particularly with catering and deforestation and land use. We do use quite a lot of wood in our sets and our set productions. So we've actually adopted a circularity model around that, where we utilize the wood that we're using in our sets to address that. And it's quite a good exercise just to highlight what your impact is, or your interface is with nature, actually. And now we're going to take that to the next level down to sort of say, well, that's good to sort of get a hotspot analysis. What's going on at each site? And how can we take the transparency a little bit further to get some true sort of traceability of the land use issues that we're a global business, the land use issues that we're facing, and the risks that we need to take responsibility for. So that's sort of footprint piece, if you like, getting our house in order. And ideally, I think organisations, what they're going to be required to do in the future is to measure that in the same way, in a consistent way, so that we can compare apples and apples, and there's a standard around it. As I said, it's a few years behind carbon accounting, which has the GHG accounting protocol, which basically dictates how you measure carbon. This one is, we're sort of building it as we go. We're kind of building the aeroplane as it's flying, if you like. So we know we've got a big problem with biodiversity collapse, and we don't want to wait until that settles, that system. So we're proactively going after it. And that's why we're piloting this new framework. We're the only media organisation to pilot TNFD. And the reason why I'm very focused on nature is, one, I'm seriously worried about it. In terms of the collapse and the rate of species loss. And interestingly, our footprint, actually, that's our metric, by the way, is species.years, which actually measures our impact in terms of our contribution to loss of species. But also because of our wildlife programming. So we're constantly documenting and filming through the NHU and reporting against nature and wildlife. And that's why the other side of this nature positive piece, if you like, is also to measure the impact of our nature programs. And we've started to do that. We did it, I've done impact research before, and we've started to apply that to our programming. So we did it against Green Planet, where we actually sort of tracked audiences and then asked them questions about their behavior, their relationship with plants, for example, as a result of watching that programming. And more recently, we've been running some surveys against our Frozen Planet 2 as well. So the idea is to try and develop a credible measurement system of impact framework across industry, actually pan-industry. We do work really closely with Sky and ITV and others on this, so that we can credibly measure it and then say, are we truly nature positive? So are we doing more good for the planet than harm, and incorporating our product, which is media?
Yeah. And I'm sure I speak for a lot of people here. It'd be great when that comes to fruition, what you're able to share about that framework. Definitely some, groundbreaking work here that others and non-media organizations can learn from as well. I mean, you're touching on with the program making, some of the real opportunities and responsibilities that, that sit with the BBC around this, maybe not with other organizations. And it'd be interesting to hear, what kind of challenges you feel you have, sitting there in the BBC in particular.
Yeah, look, I mean, we commissioned an enormous amount of content. We're like a big, public service in particular is a big kind of commissioning function. And then we, in effect, go out to market into our independent production companies to actually produce that content and then distribute that globally. So we've got a huge responsibility in that, in terms of informing and educating and inspiring our audiences. So, we have teams of people that are thinking about this, how to take that climate content pledge. We're taking it really seriously, and we have regular updates. In fact, there's one going on at the moment, to sort of say what progress is each of the broadcasters making on this. And we're also talking about potentially coming together a little bit on a particular theme. So there's so many different aspects and themes to sustainability. And what we're finding is the barriers to changing behavior or communicating this vary according to the theme. So if you're talking about energy versus waste, for example, or travel, it's quite a different conversation. And people have different attitudes to it and different behavioral change levers in order that we can, address it with, essentially. And then on top of that, you've got segmentation as well of your audiences. But the BBC has a big responsibility because of our reach. So we reach 90% of the UK population every week, 100% every month, 500 million people globally. At times we peak to 2 billion. The Queen's funeral, 2 billion people tuned into the BBC. And then the Ukraine war kicked off. Sadly, we had a huge spike of people logging into the BBC news site. So, we do have a really serious responsibility in terms of informing and educating and inspiring on this topic, to tell people the truth about what is going on. So we take that really seriously. And then in terms of sort of how do we produce all this content as well? So, ran some of the numbers, to give you some numbers. So we do, we commission about 6,000 hours of TV. BBC Studios produces about just BBC Studios produces about 2,500 hours of content. We work with lots of independent production companies as well through the Albert system, and how we work with them and commission and produce that content. We have more than 70,000 hours of radio, and that doesn't include all of our local radio. And then in addition to that, we have huge and probably the most trusted news brand in the world. And all the digital, doesn't count all the digital content that goes, apparently it's very hard to calculate it because it goes onto different platforms quite quickly. Our news that we produce gets reused onto multiple platforms. So what we're trying to do is get all of that under a sustainable system. So the Albert system works brilliantly for TV.
Could you say a bit about that? Just if lots of people don't know Albert, what it is.
No, absolutely fine. So it's called Albert because of Albert Square. A lot of people didn't know that. So that was created by the BBC well before my time, about 10 years ago. It's a carbon calculator. So if we go back to that problem of a large part of the problem for the media organization, and my concern, is energy, is our energy consumption, how we commission, produce and distribute programs. So a calculator was created essentially in a spreadsheet, and it was called Albert. Because the first time it was used was against Albert Square, and it was felt like it was quite a useful tool, and then it was taken by one of my predecessors to BAFTA, was saying, look guys, I think we've got something here, it could be quite useful for a production level carbon calculation. What do you think of it? And it's been now widely adopted as the standard or certification system. So if you watch on the credits on most programs, Sky programs, ITV programs, everybody in my position, other directors of sustainability that sit in my peer organizations, are all mandating now, 100% mandate to, if you're producing any content for us, then it has to be under the Albert certification system. And we are also creating separately, because it's been successful. It doesn't work for radio, because radio has slightly different challenges and impacts. We're creating a radio certification system for radio here at the BBC. It'll probably be an industry and world first, actually. So once that gets released, we'll probably end up gifting that to the European broadcasting community as well, and saying that we've got something here that can help you, figure out where your carbon impact is when you're producing radio. And then news, because it doesn't really work with news, because news is constantly streaming, as opposed to a TV production, which is it's got a start and end date, and you can pretty much put a wrap around it. And so we've got something called the Green Action Plans that we drive across all our news teams. So as I said, the plan is to get a complete handle on all of our production that's going on, and to put all of that under a sustainable system or standard or certification scheme, such as Albert.
Great. And as you say, when the credits go, you can see the certification. So if you weren't familiar with that before, have a look out, and you can kind of connect it back into this work. We've had a question through, and I'm going to allow a couple more to come in, but can we just take a step back? Actually, I think, you've got a really interesting role at a really important time, and I think it'd be great just to spend a couple of minutes just finding a bit about your background. What have you been doing before this, and how and why that move into the BBC?
Yeah, no, look, good question. So I was on London 2012. I was a strategist at KPMG, and I got pulled into 2012 and back in 2007, actually. And it was the first time I got exposed to a project that had a serious sustainability remit. So we promised the IOC, which is the International Olympic Committee, the greenest games ever. And I don't think any of us really knew what that meant at the time, but we promised it, and we said we were going to deliver against it. But that was my first sort of foray, if you like, into sustainability, and it became the biggest sustainable development project in Europe at the time. And it really was groundbreaking. So we had carbon as the enemy back in 2007. It was an enemy number one, and it changed the way that we designed venues. It changed the way that we operated all our logistics, and how we actually built all the venues in the Olympic Park. So and that really got me, to be honest with you. That was, I think everybody that works in this field has their moment, don't they, when they suddenly go, you know what, I really want to do this for a living. And that's completely changed the way I think. So we actually moved to Australia, and because my husband's job moved down there, and I ended up going to Macquarie University and doing an MSc in environmental science. And I haven't looked back from there, really, from that experience in London 2012, and then studying environmental science. And then I worked with a small group. It was a little like grassroots team down in Sydney called Edge, and we were doing LCA. Was LCA, life cycle assessment specialists. That's what we did. It was tough. I mean, we were a small team. At times we thought we were going to go broke because nobody seemed to want to buy our services for a while. But we made it through, and we learned a lot, and it just grew and grew and grew. And then we moved back to the UK for family reasons. And I, worked with Grosvenor, so I was a sort of sustainability strategist for them for a while. Where I was seeded in there, and then I moved to a company called Carbon Intelligence, which specializes in net zero, really, and science-based targets and the delivery of that. And I did that for a number of big organizations, including WPP, Burger King, Grosvenor as well. I was supporting them with an ongoing journey, and that's how I got pulled into the BBC. Because they said, can you come and do this for us? Actually, we need a net zero strategy. And then they said, for my sins, I must have believed in the strategy at set, because they said, will you come and deliver it for us? So I did go through a recruitment process, but I think I'm the first director of sustainability at the BBC. So, it has changed, and I report into the CFO, which is the Chief Financial Officer.
And that's unusual. Yeah. Isn't it?
It's quite unusual, and I hear from EY, who we work with actually quite closely on things like TCFD, and they help us more generally with a few other elements, actually, in terms of getting it right in our disclosures for climate. And they say that that's really good practice, apparently, to have my role reporting directly into the Chief Financial Officer, and to attach it to how we're going to pay for this, how we're going to deliver it, and I'm finding it is a good thing, actually, because you get that support, if you like, in terms of this. The organisation's fully committed to this, and actually, is going to be held to account and is delivering against it. But I also get lots of time with Tim Davey. I'm very lucky. He really is increasingly interested in this topic and taking it very seriously. He was on the stage at COP26. He asked for regular updates. And then there's Lee Ziva, who's the Chief Operating Officer as well, about how we're going to be delivering this as well. You know, what's the plan? What's the governance around it? And reporting into her ops committee directly as a critical project. So they've made my area, if you like, net zero. That net zero pillar in particular is called a critical project or a strategic project at the BBC.
Right.
So
I've got a lot of questions.
That's what you need. That's what you need. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm aware that we've had two great questions come through the Q&A. You'll have to. Can you see these as well?
Let me have a look. Do you mind reading them out? Yeah.
So two questions that kind of link up, the sustainability work with programming. So the first question, from Laura, is wondering about how you can influence scriptwriters and producers to normalize climate nature positive actions. And she suggests, like EastEnders with the viewing figures. So what role have you got from sustainability to influencing scripts?
It's training, essentially. So you're absolutely right. And there is, and so what we've done it starts all the way at the front end, actually, from commissioning. So we have sort of commissioning briefs that people have to create. And there are questions asked there about, have you incorporated sustainability and climate change into this particular program or series or script that you're about to commission for? Is it written into the brief up front? So it starts with that, and we give training to commissioners. Yeah, so they have to go on. If you're working editorial, you have to go on sort of climate basics training, essentially. Then we have separate training to train people on how to produce content as well, and that's the sort of Albert certification scheme that I was talking to. And then we have additional training as well for our news team, which is called Reporting on Sustainability. And we're about to take some of our training, the sort of basics or 101, if you like, on the climate science onto an online format. But it's about training and then measuring and holding people to account. So we do have an excellent relationship with the EastEnders guys, for example, and I did actually go up to the EastEnders site and had a wander around, and the set itself up in Elstree is where it is, and this is set, and it's kind of bizarre. You're suddenly there in the and they've got like where the EV gets. I don't watch EastEnders myself, I'll be honest with you, but it was interesting for me to go to the set, and I met the script writer, one of the senior script writers, and we had a great conversation because that particular series, it's obviously a long-standing series, and we're in the lucky position that we can fine-tune it in terms of what we're doing there, in terms of its actual, its production footprint, but also the storylines as well about how we can leverage that long-standing series. So watch this space. There'll be more coming this way. I'm told. I'm not a storyteller myself. I don't get involved in the script, but we can certainly train those people. And they know that it is a commitment that we've made to integrate it in storylines. And trust me, I never get any pushback on this, guys. Everybody wants to, get on board and to support this, to happen.
That's really, really inspiring. So, Laura, I hope that answered your questions. Pop a follow-up in the chat, or anyone else as well. We've got a great challenge question, I think, here from Debbie, who says, how do you align your ambitions for a sustainable BBC with production of what she calls highly frivolous programs, such as Strictly Come Dancing? New outfits, fast fashions, kind of this separate use. How do you influence and reduce impact there?
Oh, look, we've got to in truth, earlier, we were talking about how serious this is. We've got to halve our emissions by 2030, halve them again by 2040, and then ideally get them down to absolute zero. And I have started to agitate a lot more and get a little bit more. Somebody said, are we getting a bit more lippy now? And what I mean is that we cannot have incremental change on this. We actually need to change the way we're making programs. So we've got two choices that we can make. We either change the way we make programs, and that does sometimes mean a creative compromise, that you're not all going to be flying out somewhere, for example, and we're going to some, fancy set venue, that we need to really think about the production, the emissions as a result of making those choices and take responsibility for them. Or the better idea, and it's going to take a bit of time, is that we make the whole system green. So we make which is what we're also trying to, we're trying to do that. I outlined that earlier, I think. But it literally make all of the energy that's involved for our productions, make it renewable. Yeah. And then the problem goes away, because then you go, okay, this is fine. The rub area at the moment, as you I'm sure we'll call out, is the business, is the travel. It's people jumping on flights, wanting to, to go to exciting places. So we are getting harder on that and having a mandate in terms of if you're traveling within mainland UK, you need to not fly. Yeah, and I'm trying to take that all the way to the top. We've done that successfully in some areas, like for COP26, for example, nobody flew. I only had one person that flew in for the whole of the BBC, and there was a big attendance for that because that was a big event for us. Some of it was actually happening at our offices in Pacific Quay in terms of the events. Even Tim Davie caught the train, so I told him you haven't got an option catching the train up to Glasgow. So we can take control of that, right? We can do something about that, and we need to pass that on to what we refer to our talent, or the people that are appearing and presenting on our programmings as well. But we're also investing in remote teams. And using local teams in particular, actually. So if we take Frozen Planet, 30% of the programs for that were made for Frozen Planet, 30% of them use local teams. So we use teams in Ankara, for example. So instead of having loads of camera people or teams flying out, we are actually making an investment in BBC Studios, which is part of group, to actually train people, to train local teams across the place. So NHU can start to move away from having this reliance on flying everybody out here from the UK, and that we make an investment in these local production hubs, and that's working. And we also have BBC Media Action, if you've heard of them. They make they actually invest in training journalists globally, and particularly in places like Africa and in Asia as well. So the key to this is to try and evaporate the emissions related to the media ecosystem. But in the meantime, we're going to have to make some tough choices on how we get to places and how we do things, and switching as quickly as we can to green solutions. We've got quite a few examples.
Some of those things sound really win-win, training local teams, increasing different, areas of talent, because I think for this community, a lot of the wildlife output has been either really inspiring to us or really important part of our work, or, you don't want to have, I guess, less content, less viewers. There's some interesting challenges there. I'm just going to pick up a quick question here from the chat as well, on a slightly different theme. Becca is asking, how much do you focus on waste, costumes, sets, as part of this?
Yeah, we're eliminating waste that's going to landfill. In fact, I've done a certification recently with the Carbon Trust around this, and we are going after waste streams. The set production in particular, because I saw it with my own eyes actually in Elstree, the amount of waste, and like corridors of costumes, and it's fantastic actually. You'd have a field day there actually. But it was just all the sets actually that they have. They have them kind of in these racks, and that's why we've actually got it's called the Circular Wood or Community Wood Programme that we've actually sort of signed up into, and that is actually making sure that we have a circular FSC compliant, which is the standard for timber, as you're probably aware, the forestry is sort of like chain of custody, if you like, but also making sure that what happens to that wood at the end of its life, kind of thing. Can it be reused? And that's what we're leaning into them to do, so it doesn't go to landfill, doesn't end up in skips, for example. So and we're working very hard against each of our offices as well, actually, to segregate waste and avoid it going to landfill as much as possible. So this is something that we're starting to lean into a little bit more, actually, because it's so visible for people, and people want to see that, in their offices, that, they want to, if they're segregating and spending the time segregating, that it is ending up in the right place. And that it's not ending up in our oceans, for example, which, Blue Planet highlighted. So yeah, it's important to us.
It'd be great to, just touch on staff engagement. You're saying that there's an open door and interest from across the BBC. Are there some challenges, or can you get people to move faster?
Look, I think we're in a climate emergency, so we just do need to move faster. And it is largely about communication, engagement and training. So if you get those three elements right, how we communicate, and we're starting to get some good top level comms coming out of the sort of Tim office, if you like. We have these stay connected calls at the BBC, and I've been on quite a few of those actually. So they've been giving us a big kind of microphone, if you like, in terms of talking to our staff and engaging with them. And that's important because it needs to be real. We need to tell people about what we're doing, how we're going to do it. And it needs to come from Tim himself, from the top table. But we also need to, it's a big organization. It's very siloed, lots of divisions. There's about 22,000 staff, so we need to do this to get everybody pointing in the same direction, and be very directive really on what they can do. So the challenge for sustainability, what makes it so hard, is that each division has different materiality, if you like, or different challenges and opportunities. So, how I work with news, for example, is very, very different from how I work with radio. How I work with sports and the challenges there is very, very different from, the opportunities that exist in technology or in our property estate, et cetera, et cetera. So you really need to nuance this thing, or figure out what we're putting in place. It's about to go live. I'm really excited, and there will be some. We will go public and how we've done it, because that's part of our role as well as telling people how we've got to net zero. Right? We've got a platform that we're putting in place. So a lot of our carbon accounting previously was done in spreadsheets, and it's very normal. That's how you do it. You get all the data in, it follows the accounting protocol, and then you do the calculations and modeling in spreadsheets. We've now moved all of that to an online system, and it will soon be announced. It's due to go live at the 29th of November. And that will give each of the divisions their own dashboard as to what their emissions are, what the opportunities are, how they're tracking to plan, how they're contributing to other targets as well. So we touched on the waste target, gas consumption, business travel, etc., and how they're tracking against it. And then we can start to hold people to account, to say you're above the line, below the line, and this is where we are in terms of our pathway and where we need to be. So what's challenging, I think, because I think you touched on that, is it's a technical topic, this. I've been doing this 16 years. I've got an MSc. I've been lucky enough to work with some of the best people in terms of teaching me the fundamentals of GHG accounting and technicalities. I've got 2 people joining my team that have got that background, that have got technical expertise. So we've got a professional technical team. Most people in my team now have an MSc at least. In sustainable. It surprises people, but it's technical. It's a to understand things like emissions factors and EEIO and GHG accounting protocol rules, and what things like CDP are, and you need to have done it, or have studied it, or have an acumen for the technical detail on this, because ultimately the data is really, really important, and how we measure it. So
and I think I just wanted to pick up a really good point, actually, but from Isabella, as a question, saying a lot of the teams in the BBC working in a fast-paced, demanding production schedule. I'm sure the news teams are, on it all the time, and how sustainability can be integral, kind of like, woven into the fabric of every day. Which I think
that's what you want. You've got to make it part of your DNA, so that people don't even think about it. It just becomes part of their behavior. And that, and some things are difficult, like the news team, for example, they've got to fly out to places to go, to go and get the story. And sometimes you just can't avoid but catching that flight, in order to get there in time. So there needs to be a little bit of flexibility. But for some programs, you can plan that. You can plan when you're going to travel, how you're going to get things there. And, we've got local hubs now that we're developing at the BBC. So we've got perhaps more than other broadcasters to a degree, because we've been, held to account on this across the UK model and our nations and regions, so, and we have been successfully due to COVID. COVID in lots of ways did help re-engineer how we produce content. So as for the sports example, we had the Tokyo Olympic Games, and then we had the Beijing Winter Games, and that was actually mostly filmed out of Salford. It was a remote production model that worked really well for us. And so all of these things are possible. we can do them with the help of technology. It's just about, getting everybody aligned to that and saying, right, we can't, and we are seeing, I'll be honest with you, we are seeing some uplift in our business travel now and our emissions, because people are going, great, we can get back out there again. And we're going, whoa, please don't do that. We don't want you to do that. And that sometimes some of these things, they're a win-win in terms of carbon, but also cost savings as well.
Yeah, there's an interesting nuance, I think, that, Becca's picked up here. 22,000 staff, how empowered are staff? Is this coming top down, or are people kind of climate literate, nature literate, able to make decisions on the ground?
Look, I'll be honest, it's hard, it's mixed. We've got a bit of a journey to go on in terms of reaching everybody, training everybody, getting this into their DNA. The news team, because I think it's probably swimming around them a little bit more in terms of the reporting that they do. So that team is pretty active, and they have a climate science unit as well that supports the editorial side of our news output as well. Other teams are not as close to this, and we've got to hold their hand a lot more. Radio is quite new because it doesn't have the Albert system, for example. So creating that whole standard and how we do that. And the sports guys, sometimes when they're working in co-production models, there's a tension there, because they say, well, look, our peers are all flying off to Qatar, for example, so why can't we? So help people know the ambition now. I mean, we will be running some staff surveys, so it'd be interesting to see, actually. So we tracked it about a year ago, and the response, I'll be honestly, wasn't great in terms of understanding what our position was and what our strategy was. And because we've had quite a bit of push on comms, Tim talking about it, as I said, we are a critical project. So most people know that in the BBC and then that gets fed down to what we call our senior leaders, and then to team leaders. And so I spend a lot of time on calls articulating what it means and what's expected of the senior leaders as well, in particular. So we've given them toolkits for each of their division. We've asked for their plan. And now we've got this data platform that's going to start to say, hold on a minute, because the platform, which is I think this is going to be the clever bit, is actually takes all of our emissions data at the charge code level. So it goes 5 levels down, literally from a division to, a subdivision to a team to an actual individual. One charge code is basically a cost code that we can calculate carbon against. So that goes down to an individual program level. So we're going to start to get some really interesting insights from that data once it's launched.
Okay. Well, we're nearly out of time. We haven't been able to pick up all of the questions. Do pop them in the chat. I was hoping, Danielle, to put you on the spot. I know just before we started, you were telling me about a really interesting conversation you had yesterday with one of the people involved with the IPCC report. And I think I'd love to end the session with you just sort of sharing some of the insights from that conversation and your thoughts about it.
Yeah, look, no, yesterday I was very lucky. We had a sort of informal conversation with Professor Julia Steinberger, and she works on the IPCC. She's in the working group, and she contributes to those, the climate change IPCC reports. She's a climate scientist. She's very well regarded, and she's also an expert in systems change as well. So I asked her directly. I said, given what you read and where are we? Are we at 1.1 degrees or 1.2 degrees right now? What's your thinking on that? And then I also asked her, what point do you think we're going to smash through the 1.5 degree barrier? What year? Because I'm reading a particular number. And so she told me that she doesn't think we're at 1.1. She thinks we're right now at 1.25 degrees, in her opinion. And she's very close to the science. So some of what gets fed into these IPCC reports or presumably gets sort of like normalized a little bit. But she thinks that we're at 1.25 degrees already. And that's why we're seeing the extreme weather events that we're seeing across the world. And she also thinks that we're going to smash through the 1.5 degree goal, unfortunately, in the early 2030s. And not 2040, what I was reading. So it was just a fascinating, we had a wider conversation about what we're going to do about it. And so all of the team, because we were all in this meeting, have come off going, oh my God, we cannot get away with incremental change here. It needs to be exponential change. It needs to be step change if we're going to turn this ship around. And so, I feel sadly, in some ways I was sad by that conversation, but I was reinvigorated from the conversation to do something about it and to get out there and to agitate, because this definitely is a climate crisis or a climate emergency, and we need to be responding in that way.
Brilliant. Well, a good challenge to you, to the teams, to staff. I can see that we have some BBC staff in the audience who are probably ready and willing to kind of help with the challenge. It's been great to have the conversation, and a big thanks to everyone in the chat who asked questions, who maybe didn't get to, we didn't get to you in the end. I'm really sorry that Hannah couldn't be here to join. We'll have to pick up the conversation with her another time in her perspective as a presenter and part of the system that way. But otherwise, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Danielle. Let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks for the opportunity. Great to be here. Thanks, Savita.
Yeah.
Bye for now, everyone.